Hey, good morning. So, I'm out on Alki Beach today, and I'm reminded of a time, September 23rd, 1907. And Stephen Anderson and a friend, so he's about a teenager, was down here at Alki Beach, on Alki Point, and they spotted a trunk tied up in ropes. Now you can imagine having visions of Treasure Island running through their head. They go running up to this trunk. They take the ropes off, flip the lid open, and what they see is the trunk's filled with rocks on top of a quilt. So they go digging through the rocks, getting them out, going underneath the quilt, and all of a sudden, Stephen feels the hair on a head, and there's a body in the trunk with a naked young woman, gagged, and had been strangled by a t-shirt. So the cops are called in. They come to start their investigation. And what they find in the trunk, besides the body, the quilt, and the rocks, is a letter from Frank to his sister. Now this letter from Frank to his sister, Edith Covington, she lives in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it says that he's thinking about going to Alaska. So there you have it. Clue number one, a forgotten letter in a trunk with a dead body. So the police take the body to the medical examiner, and she's starting to be decomposed, face is really swollen, difficult to make identification. But he did notice that there was a small mole on her little pinky and a slight indentation on her nose. And so they do a publication in the newspaper, hoping that they could get some people, get the public's help in identifying the body. So later, after the press release, they do get a call from a brother and sister, Jeannie and George Robinson. And they said the description matches their missing niece, who is Agnes Covington, recently married to Frank Covington. So this wedding between Agnes and Frank was not wanted by the family. And it's interesting to note that Frank and Charles used to live in Portland with a Mrs. Mitchell. And Mrs. Mitchell was a friend of Agnes's grandmother. And so one vacation from Seattle going down to Portland, that's where Agnes met Frank. She was very taken by him. And then she returned to Seattle, and Frank and Charles were hanging out with Mrs. Mitchell, and it turns out Mrs. Mitchell enjoyed having a drink also. And she noticed that, that Frank was a little bit effeminate. And I thought it'd be kind of fun to dress him up as a woman and see if they could fool some of her friends. So they dress her up. He decided to go by the name Mrs. Blank, and they started going around town, being introduced to different friends, and several men were quite taken with him and were interested in courting. And in fact, one man had dropped down on his knee and asked for his hand, in engagement. That's when they decided to come clean. They told everybody it was just a joke. Well, the joke was not taken well by the other people, and a couple of men threatened to thrash Frank severely. So Frank and Charles thought it best that they maybe move on up to Seattle. And of course, one of the first people they look up, arriving in Seattle, was Agnes. So it turns out that Agnes, married to Frank Covington, was living with Charles Burlison in an apartment up on 5th Street in Seattle. The three of them were living in this small apartment. And when the police went to the apartment, the landlord had said that they had moved out just several weeks earlier. Now the Seattle Star also did some investigating, has a couple of reports in, and and I dropped it down in the description below. And in interviewing with the neighbors, they found out that a couple of weeks back, when the threesome or trio was still in the apartment, there was a fight one night, a large fight. They heard Agnes scream, and they heard a lot of dumping and bumping of furniture. And that was the last I saw of them. That's the last I saw of Agnes. They didn't see Agnes again after that event. And then the trio had moved out. Of course, the landlord was just as pleased that they were gone, because it prevented them from having to start an eviction notice. So the next big break in the case came when they found an expressman who had picked up Frank and Charles in a chest, and on the way to where they were going to deliver it, there was a change in destination, and they went to A.E. Parker's wharf. And Mr. Parker remembers unloading that chest from the, up onto the dock on the wharf. And it was unusual for him because his business was transporting and shipping gravel and sand. So this really stood out for him. And he said later the next day, he found the inside shelving, the casing, inside shelving you put in to fold up your clothes, in the water. And so the police surmised that they took out that shelf, and so they had more room for rocks. Now I'm not sure if the chest ever went below surface, but the currents, it didn't sink and stick to the bunk because the currents were able to deliver it here at Alki Beach. So the police continued to look for him. There was rumors that they went to Alaska, and they put out, warnings to the Alaskan police to please be on the lookout for these two men. There was also talk that they were going to go to Australia. They had lookouts in Chile. In the end, they weren't able to find them. They picked up several men along the way, held them, questioned them, and they determined it wasn't the people they were looking for. Somewhat of an interesting story, thinking about the boys who found it, the excitement to the dread and the revulsion. But I came across her death certificate, Agnes's death certificate. And I tell you, that really brings it home. Even though it was 1907, that death certificate made her real to me. So rest in peace, Agnes.